Hi, everybody. On the road, special edition or something with a wonderful guest. I'm Roy, startup investor in the future of work. And every day we answer one question of yours about work. Today is day 114. And we've got Lucy Caldwell with us, who is
Hey.
rare in that she is an expert at the intersection of advocacy, having done a lot of work around with elected officials and political campaigns and otherwise, and tech. And at her prior company, she's the founder now, by the way, of an early stage audience intelligence platform called Mockingbird Labs. But at her prior company, she had the experience now because it's the end of the year, which is your company is getting acquired, and you're trying to figure out, not as the founder necessarily, but as an executive of the company, should how should you handle it? And so, Lucy, would love to hear your perspective for people who are on the leadership teams of companies being acquired. Like, give them some wisdom on how they should think about it.
Totally. Well, thank you so much for having me. I think in the spirit of this is not advice, there is no one size fits all advice for people who find themselves in that position. I think it's so dependent on where you are in your career cycle, especially for women, we find, whether or not what's going on in your family life, whether for better or for worse. So I think that while I know of lots of stories of people who have found, really close friend of mine just went through an acquisition right before COVID, for her, staying with the acquiring company and helping to shepherd that acquisition through was a great opportunity to also spend more time with her kids during
Love
a
that.
pandemic. She's so happy. I think for other people, there really may not be a place for you in the company afterward. So while there is no one size fits all advice for what to do, I think there is probably a one size fits all guide to how to make that decision and what your perspective should be, which is that I think you have to keep a couple of things in mind. One, it really may not be up to you. It probably is not going to be up to you. And that, I think, is a really hard thing for anyone who's been in a founder or leadership role at a startup company, because part of what has made the company successful up until that point has been you throwing yourself into it and really getting to the point where you think there is nothing else I could be doing in my life than making this company successful.
Yeah.
So no matter how wonderful your acquisition feels, it's not going to be how you think it is. And there's an element of it that you have to think about. Look, what got you here, you, the company, may not get you there. And you may not be the person who moved the company. And that's really hard. So I think getting your, honestly, something as core as your mental health house in order in advance of an acquisition, and being selfish because you've probably made a lot of sacrifices. So think about what you want to be doing and whether it's what the company is doing. For me, the acquisition of CrowdScout, the company that I was chief strategy officer of for 5 years, was an opportunity at a really odd time at the beginning of 2019 to throw myself into getting back to my roots in advocacy and working on the Never Trump movement.
Thank you for that.
So I think thinking about what are the things you'd be doing if you weren't doing this, I think that's part of what's sort of key for a lot of folks that gets lost sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you some of the things I hear you saying. One is that there's this meta pattern around big decisions of like, know yourself first, which comes up again and again and again. And then there's also this identity dislocation that can happen of like, you're an executive at a company that's started by its founder. And there's always, not always, in success, there's often this feeling of esprit de corps, and we're all fused as one. And many founders I know go through this as well, where the founders say something like, well, this is my baby. And they say something like, this is my baby, and something like, I really care about which acquirer is going to treat the team the best after, which is a great and valid thing to care about. But the day after the acquisition, they have 100 times less control than they may have had before. And so just
I'm going to jump in here, Lucy, because I think Roy's in the
admitting
car.
that you may need to, I hope you still have audio from me. Okay, there we go. Solve for what's best for you. is really hard. And I really appreciate what you say about being selfish. And of course, I can't relate to what it's like as a woman to be in that position. But thinking about your whole life and holistically, is it a chance to take a risk? Is it a chance to spend time more with your family? I really appreciate that. I think that there's I think the warning I hear in what you're saying is avoid assuming that whatever mentality you had prior to the acquisition about the role of the company in your life or your role there will necessarily follow afterward. And Min, thank you for joining as I was glitching here in the car. So thank you, Lucy. And Lucy, can I just ask you one other little question, which is you have a rare experience, which is having crossed over between tech and other worlds, especially the advocacy and politics world. I'd just love to hear any reflections on like what you wish people in tech knew about the advocacy world you're in, or vice versa. Just any thoughts on translation before we wrap.
Yeah, there's so much lost in translation. I've been on this kind of theme that a thing that drives me absolutely nuts is when people on campaigns talk about how campaigns are like startups, because they're not. Campaigns are a horrible place for professional development. You have no notion of when to ship a product or how to sort of make tweaks. It's all happening on the day that a reform is voted on or that the people go to the ballot box, whatever. I think by the same token, I think that often people in tech think that we could solve many more problems with tech. And I think we can solve a lot. And I think it's a net gain. But I also sometimes feel like something lost in translation between the two is that politics is super irrational, full of super irrational actors who do not respond to market forces in the way that there's no sense of product market fit. If there were, we would have totally different looking political parties and political leaders.
Totally.
So I think that I think right now the kind of biggest intersection to think about, my alarm is going to go off while we're doing this, is that there's so much that could be achieved by those things working together. I think there tends to be we tend to operate in a paradigm where they're at odds with each other, as though the proliferation of social media platforms or other ways is somehow at odds with people having their voices heard, when it's actually the opposite, right? It's great that we even have a scenario now where a random anonymous person could get canceled for saying something egregious, because we're also in a world where someone who has something really important to say, their story and voice can get elevated overnight. So I hope that the marriage will become, between politics and tech, will become a happier one in the years to come.
I love that. I mean, I love that you resisted the simplicity of flattening it to, it's the same because X. And, I'll just say one of my observations is that there tends to be a lot of judgment where people say like, oh, people in government, it's so slow. It's like, I'm sorry, the very people I've ever worked with in my life are comms people in government, because they solve the problem arises in the morning and by the evening they've solved it. And so I appreciate hearing that and hearing the differences. So thank you for not giving advice, Lucy. And I'm looking forward to doing this again at some point in the future. And I think, as I hope folks know, we answer your questions here. So feel free to ask them. Hit us up anywhere else. We will be back, I think, Min, tomorrow. When will we be back?
We'll be back tomorrow with another episode of This Is Not Advice. And so to be continued. Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you. To be continued.
Thanks so much,
you, Lucy,
you guys.
so much. Really appreciate it.